All right, we are live. Joining me today is a extra special guest, Benji Kozuch. Benji, for those who don't know you, can you say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, I am an assistant, soon-to-be associate professor at the University of Alabama, and we can all assume that I research something concerning consciousness. More specifically, my program tries to bridge the gap between philosophical and neuroscientific theories of consciousness. Generally speaking, we have a bunch of a priori generated philosophical theories of consciousness. The time is nigh now where we can actually empirically test them. And so I'm often looking for connections between the fields of neuroscience and philosophy, putting philosophical theories of consciousness in the crucible of neuroscientific results.
Yeah, awesome. So you said your program is interested in this, so there's a whole group of people down there in Alabama doing this.
My research program, it's just me.
Oh, I see. I see.
Well, it is a program. I give it a name and everything. It's the neuroscience philosophy program, but I'm the only member.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, army of one. So yeah, that's cool. I mean, and you do a lot of interesting work connecting neuroscience to philosophy, and particularly, I mean, so I think most of your work, at least that currently, is aimed at critiquing other theories of consciousness and evaluating evidence for them. But have you actually argued or defended? Are you like have a particular view of consciousness that you defend, or is it mostly subjecting others to scrutiny?
Well, most directly, it is critiquing existing theories. The idea would be, though I don't talk about this that often in my publications, would be that we have a couple main contenders for philosophical theories of consciousness at this point, and evidence against one of them de facto acts as evidence for the other one in a last man standing sort of way. So you could say, by the way, that a lot of, a good 30–40% of my research is directed at critiquing higher order approaches to consciousness. And insofar as it successfully does that, then it's going to make more, add to the epistemic standing of the other major contenders, such as first order representationalist theories.
But you also have attention theories as well.
Yeah, yes, I critique those as well. It's another line of research.
So, but those are a first order theory.
Yeah, I suppose so. Do you think it's required that it be a first order theory?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it really depends on what you think attention is and how it works. But if you define higher order, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you go.
There are times at which when we're looking at the neuroscientific basis of things like higher order states, higher order thoughts, what we usually need to do is we need to find a function to identify them with. And so what sorts of cognitive functions that we know the human brain engages in and animal brains engage in that would be candidates for producing higher order states? One of them would be, working memory. Another would be like action monitoring. Another one also would be attention. Like, it seems potentially that the way that attention would work is it would form higher order states about lower order states in order to determine what was to be attended to. So I could be edified on this, but I take it to be maybe an open question as to whether an intentional theory is going to be first order or second order. As someone like Prinz explicitly identified their theory as being qualifying as not a higher order theory or not a second order theory.
I think so. Yeah, so it depends on like if you think that the attention re-represents. So I take higher order theories that crucial claim to be that there's a representation of yourself as being in a particular kind of state, so a re-representation of the state. And I think Jesse, someone like him, thinks that what attention does is basically select or amplify certain processes so that they get into work in a memory, but that's not re-representing them.
Yeah, well, currently in working memory literature, there's a debate about what role the PFC plays in it. One of the theory that was in favor for a while said that what happens is the information is actually transferred to the PFC where it's held in working memory, which sounds like a re-representational sort of theory of working memory. On the other hand, and then in the case of the usurpian theory, it's going to be something that's just manipulated in sensory areas and amplified. So this seems like there could be an analogical sort of way to understand the attention, the attention interpretation as well, as far as first or second order.
No, that's a good point. I think that also this is something that needs more attention. Haha, get it? I think people need to pay more attention to this because one of the essential claims that I think needs to be analyzed and talked about more is whether attention itself is a way of becoming aware of something. Because if it isn't, then it can't be a higher order type of theory. But if attending to something is a way of being aware of that thing, then it is a candidate for being a higher order theory. You know, I actually asked Jesse one time whether he thought attending to something was a way of being aware of it. And he seemed to think maybe yes, but I know other people that would say no to that really, you know, perception and thinking are the ways that we're generally aware of things.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think your point is well taken. I should include attentional theory as being something that gains credence by showing that higher order theories look more implausible for some reason. Unless we have independent reasons for discounting attentional theories, which I have.
Yeah. So would you say, I mean, before I get to that, I want to talk to you about the critique and the stuff that you actually written, but I was just curious about your positive views here. You say first order representational views, is that the kind of view that you're most likely to endorse? Or something like a tie type account, or something like Block or Ned's account, or
I'm much more partial to such a theory, especially if it turns out that higher order theories don't work out. But there's problems with, you know, this is a very long-term project here, and so you take each potential theory and you scrutinize it for quite a bit of time. Representationalism has a lot of scrutiny that still needs to be paid to it. Something that you pointed out in the past is that it seems like representationalism doesn't have a great way to distinguish unconscious from conscious mental states, since we have representations everywhere in the brain. Yeah. So there's things to question about representationalism, but that's not so much my current program. I've written some stuff to try and help the representationalism out. So I've come up with an account of a representational account of pain experiences, which has always bedeviled representationalism. And so I try and help the theory that I put a little bit more credence into. I try and help it along a little bit here and there, but I can't claim that I've really done a lot as far as trying to support a positive theory so far.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. Generally though, would you say you're a supporter of phenomenological overflow? The basic idea that this overflows what we can access or report?
I'm definitely in favor of that.
Yeah, because like your Gorilla in the Mist, but not unseen paper, where you argue against attentional theories, the necessity thesis that attention is necessary.
Right.
There, it seems that you do rely on, I mean, you argue for it, but it seems like in the background is a kind of claim that the conscious experience is going to exceed what we can access or report about.
Yeah, we'd have to probably really define those terms carefully, but I think it lends itself pretty naturally to it. Once you have stuff that falls outside of attention, that is phenomenologically manifest, that sounds pretty close to it also just being inaccessible in a Blockian sense.
Well, once you allow that it's not accessed, it sounds pretty close to being inaccessible. Is that what you just said?
Well, once you say that it's something that's not a subject of attention, let me put it a slightly different way. Once you show that there are phenomenological experiences that are outside of what you're attending to, it seems to lend itself to supporting something like a thesis like phenomenal consciousness happens outside of access more generally. But it's not the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, I'm someone who thinks that you could have consciousness outside of attention, but still probably require some kind of access in order to have experience.
And then there's a distinction between accessed and accessible.
Right.
And are you more of an there's nothing that's outside, that's phenomenologically manifest, that's inaccessible, but you would allow that it might be phenomenologically manifested without being actually accessed. Would that be your position?
I'm very skeptical of that position. Yes,
Um,
that wouldn't be my position. No.
okay.
I mean, there's empirical things that we're going to talk about, I assume shortly, but generally I find the idea of in unaccessed conscious experience to be very puzzling, bordering on conceptually confused.
So
I just don't know what it would mean for there to be phenomenal consciousness, which is there's meaning that there's something that it's like for me to be in the state, but yet there's no kind of access at all. And I think even people like Block say that there's got to be some kind of access. It just isn't cognitive access. So having those states without any kind of access at all, I just don't even really know what that would mean, to be honest.
and so you're saying at any moment some state is phenomenologically manifest, it is being accessed in some sense.
Yeah.
It's not merely that it's accessible, it's being accessed at that moment. I'm putting aside exactly how we're going to define access here. That's the thesis in general that you're supporting.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I just don't, I mean, it's a shortcoming on my part. I've argued with a lot of people about this, but I just don't really know what it would mean for there to be experience that was mine, that it was like for me to have, but yet which was not in any way accessed. It just, I'm not even sure what that amounts to. Like, what does that mean? Can you help me understand what that means?
I do. Well,
So
we probably have a different idea of access in mind.
Okay.
For one thing, I mean, that's one starting point. Like, well, this is just the conceptual claim here. Like, we might have something different in mind as far as access goes. It does not give me a headache to try and think of that.
Well, so
the magic pill for a moment ago.
can you say more about that though? So why doesn't it give you a headache? In what sense is it? Are you experiencing it if you have no access to it?
So, I mean, access could mean that it's something that gets grabbed by the cognitive system and put into play in certain other kinds of operations. And I don't see it as being needed to be grabbed in this sense for it to be. So I have a conscious experience as of redness. I don't see that needing to be accessed for there to be this little bit of phenomenology coming into existence.
Well, so you're talking about cognitive access though, but I'm talking about like that there's some. How is it your experience then? How is it for you?
I think I can say that I don't know what the me is here. With phenomenology, I think the thought is the thinker, as one James put it. You've got a little, think about what the panpsychist says. They have little packages of experience. Now I'm not a panpsychist, but I can understand the concept of there being a little package of experience in my brain that's not being accessed, and it's phenomenologically manifest. And if you want to say whatever is that little package of experience, you want to throw the label of me on it, okay, yeah, sure. But I don't even know what a self is anyway that you want to invoke in saying that in what sense is it for me? Unless you want to say that it's something that's brought into the broader personality or something like that. And then we're talking about something that is an access in some stronger sense. So it gets integrated into this notion of a self that I have and what I am and all that. And then we've got a much more substantial sense of access at that point.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I find that pretty puzzling because the way that phenomenal consciousness is usually defined is in terms of there being something that it's like for the subject. So it's part of the definition that there's a subject who's having the experience. In fact, I think it's kind of almost conceptually, Galen Strawson says at one point that, what he called his, the craziest view he ever had, or she has something like that, where he says that every experience is the experience plus a self. So, I mean, it seems like, well, anyway, so maybe we shouldn't get too hung up on this because it's sort of orthogonal to the questions that I was originally thinking of asking you about, but I just don't know what it would mean to be a package of experience that was free floating. Because then, yeah, you may as well just think that it's out there objectively, independent of any mind. And that seems a bit strange.
What I'm saying is I'm calling whenever you get a little bit of experience, you've got basically a mind and the subject by the very fact of it. And that doesn't need to be like Benji Kozuch, the philosopher who lives in Alabama and so forth. It doesn't have to be integrated into a self in that sense. It's just,
yeah.
And this is where I agree with you. Like there would be a conceptual incoherence in that. I just take it to be that there is a subject. I mean, it's just kind of, if you have an experience, then there's a subject in some sense.
So then, but what you're saying, it sounds like, is that there doesn't need to be any structure to that, or the relationship between the experience and the subject.
Yeah, exactly. But well, yes, yeah, it's all kind of together. And then Benji Kozuch can become aware of the experience of this little package of experience, and then it gets integrated into other sorts of things. But at the very moment that it just comes into existence, it doesn't need to have something more substantial than whatever is entailed just by having that experience, by that experience being present.
Right.
I'll word a little more carefully. But anyway, we're getting pretty deep in the mire here.
Yeah.
Access consciousness.
Yeah, well, because I mean, I think that's one of the benefits of higher order theories, which I want to ask you about, but that's one of the benefits of them, is they can give an account of what the structure or relationship is between the subject and the experience that accounts for this kind of thing that we're talking about. Whereas I think that first order theories, they don't have a way of saying anything meaningful about this relationship, and so they become,
I don't know if you can hear me, but you have
primitivists, which is, not a very satisfying. Hello, is this the incredulous stare I've heard so much about? Oh, no. Benji. We're frozen here, folks. Well, my connection is excellent, so I'm not sure if he can hear me or not. Let's find out. One of the joys of live broadcasting is these sorts of things, our access to each other has been terminated. Oh, shit. Oh, bummer. All right, so let's hope he's going to jump back in. All right, well, let's see. While we're waiting for Benji to come back, it looks like we have someone asking a question. What form of thought does this fall under? Sherry Lynn from Florida is asking. Oh, he's back. You're back.
Yeah.
What happened? Did I piss you off? Like, this is too a priori for me. I'm out of here.
I went to the corner and counted to 10. And she said, maybe he'll talk about something else now.
It's not likely. But anyway, so
really boring, and I don't understand.
Oh, fun stuff.
Here we are at part 2.
Yeah, part 2. Well, anyway, so I was trying to segue into talking about higher order theories here, because I was saying that I think that this is one of their main benefits, is that they have an account here, which, and one way of putting it is what distinguishes a conscious state from an unconscious state.
Yeah.
But also, I think it's important, and this is where your work really picks up, is that it's an empirical claim. You can't really, I don't really buy a priori analysis of consciousness in this sense. So, there are some higher order theorists like Rocco Gennaro who says that, it's a priori that the transitivity principle is true or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's right. I think it's, part of, I think you could make the argument like David Rosendahl does, as part of our folk psychological notion. that there's something weird about it. But I don't know, the more folk you talk to, the less that I think actually pans out. So I think the real place where the rubber hits the road is in the empirical stuff, which is why I really appreciate the stuff that you do, because you want to take seriously the claim that this theory makes and see what the empirical data actually show about it. If you think that that's right, though, that this is mainly an empirical issue?
Yeah, I regard it as an empirical issue. Just as I regard most philosophical issues that I find substantial to ultimately be. So outside of value theory, I feel like most of the issues that I'm interested in philosophy are going to be ones that could, at least in principle, be empirically decided, if not at this present time.
Yeah.
That's, hey, we're here to talk about me. So there's my general take on philosophy.
So but you said outside of value theory. So you're gonna leave questions about value outside of that. You don't think those are empirically tractable?
I think there's certain value questions that are interesting that can't probably be empirically determined.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, look, hey, Richard, if you're going to stop every time I say something wildly implausible off the cuff, we're not going to get anywhere.
All right, then. So can you tell us?
Talking out my.
Yeah. So can you tell us about what do you think is it's a big question, but just to get us in the ballpark, what is the empirical case against higher order theories? What do you think the strongest?
Well, as you're anticipating, I think that if you look at the subset of empirical data that concerns brain lesions, it would be that certain predictions that I think higher order theories should make as to what happens when higher order state producing areas are damaged are not seen when you look at brain lesion data. So if higher order theory is correct, then there's some place in the brain where these higher order states are going to be produced and they're going to be necessary for having conscious experiences, according to the theory. You figure out what places those are. Most people think that they're the PFC. And you look at what sorts of deficits you have. And my contention would be, if you look at the deficits, we don't see anything like what we would expect to see if higher order theory is true and if the higher order states were being produced in the PFC. I mean, the claim can be made much more broadly too, with some research I have in progress. Even if you look at places outside of the PFC that might produce these higher order states, you again don't see the right kinds of deficits.
So this is what you call phenomenological blindness. You would expect there to so you define something as an integral area if it's responsible for producing these higher order states, and if there was damage, you would expect massive amounts of higher order states to be absent, and which would manifest itself phenomenologically. That's the basic.
Yeah, well, it's, to put it slightly differently, if you damage one of these areas and you see X% production, X% reduction in the ability to produce higher order states, then you should see something like X% of a person's phenomenology also take leave. So if you damage someone's higher order state producing area and they lose 25% of their ability to produce higher order states, then what you should see is 25% of the person's phenomenology go missing in some sense. There's a lot of different ways that this can happen. I think you just read the paper in which I carry out a somewhat careful analysis about the ways in which this can manifest, this loss of higher order states. But stated most broadly, there should be a commensurate loss in phenomenology to whatever the loss is in the ability to produce higher order states. And so if you have brain areas that are damaged in such a way that you notice that the subjects have manifested cognitive deficits that are appreciable, then you would also expect there to be appreciable deficits in their ability to have visual experiences. So now you talk about phenomenological blindness. There is the case where a person completely loses their ability to produce higher order states. And it seems like since higher order states says the thing that brings phenomenology into existence is having higher order states, you've lost the complete ability to have higher order states. That means you've completely lost the ability to have any kind of phenomenology, including visual phenomenology. What is a lack of visual phenomenology? It's basically blindness. So you would basically end up phenomenologically blind and be indistinguishable from what it's like to be a person who's completely blind. Now, I don't know if we should ever expect that to happen, even if higher order theory is true. It's very rare that someone completely loses a cognitive function when any brain area is damaged. Even in cases of blindness where the visual cortex is damaged, people will often have phosphenes, or it'll just be scotomas, or hemi-blindness where half the visual field is gone, or so forth. But what we would call pure phenomenological blindness, that'd be the case where you completely lose the ability to produce higher order states, and then that would look like something just like what it would be like to be completely blind.
Right.
That's what the theory seems to predict.
So you have to be a bit careful there, though, because it predicts that phenomenologically you would lose experience, but you wouldn't behave as if you were blind. You'd have like a super blind sight.
Yeah. So now you're getting into the issue. So far we've been restricting ourselves to the issue of what it would be phenomenologically like.
Yeah.
But now you're talking about behavioral differences.
Right.
And you're saying the behavior might be exactly the same. That's where you think there's a possibility to be exactly the same.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So people who are blind, though, they don't describe it as being exactly the same. They describe it as being phenomenologically very different.
Well, you're talking about phenomenology. So if you were to totally disable the areas that make higher order states, which we're assuming is in the prefrontal cortex, although that's not part of the higher order theory per se, but is I'd say a good guess based on what we know about what the prefrontal cortex does.
We adopt it as an assumption for the time being.
Yeah.
Anywhere the PFC.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there are there are people like Axel, Clearmans, who aren't going to really localize it in the PFC, and so there are other options that you could explore. But I think I myself like the prefrontal cortex as a possible.
Just for the sake of the present discussion, let's just go with the PFC as our example.
Yeah.
And you can make a point.
So if you could disable that completely, but leave everything else intact in some way, then a person's behavior wouldn't be changed. They would still be able to perform tasks, discriminating things, being button presses and verbal report, but they wouldn't have any experience.
Mm-hmm. So
they wouldn't even know, actually, because the parts of the brain which access allow them to introspect would also be missing.
Yeah, so it's a curious prediction. The first thing to point out is that having considered the issue and looked at lesion data and how lesions typically affect the PFC, it seems very unlikely that we'd end up one of these scenarios where there was a 100% loss of the ability to produce higher order states.
Yeah.
There's that case that people haggle over a lot these days from the 1930s. The stockbroker who had his entire PFC removed. And that might be a case like that, but typically they're going to have partial cognitive deficits.
Yeah.
And so
it's highly controversial, as you know, but it's not clear that the entire PFC was removed.
Right. I try to acknowledge that. It's up to debate right now. The entire, yes. Did you? What more can I do, Richard?
Yeah, exactly.
The finger thingies.
Exactly.
But that might be one case in which it could have happened. But other than that, a lot of times, if it's going to be a naturally occurring lesion, it's not going to be a complete loss of the ability to produce higher order states. So we need to consider that as well. And how would you adapt your argument in that case? So the problem we're running into a moment ago is like the exact thing that the person would use to say that their phenomenology had changed, they couldn't use anymore.
Right.
But do we have the same problem as a partial loss of the ability to produce higher order states?
Yeah, so I think that there's an argument that you could make that the part of the brain which produces higher order states, it overlaps or has some machinery in common with the part of the brain that does metacognition, which is associated with things like introspection and knowing about your own mental state. So if there's an impairment in one, you would predict an impairment in the other to some degree.
But it would be perfectly overlapping, not just partially, because if the overlapping ever broke, the person might be able to realize that their visual experience had changed in some in some fantastic way, in some notable way. And
Yeah.
it's worth mentioning too here that you know, the higher order theorists can't have it both ways, in that they often appeal to studies in which they say that there are deficits in consciousness as a result of PFC lesions, right? And so here we have they're taking a report of the subject and they're saying, the subject saying they have a deficit in consciousness, here is evidence for higher order theory because there's a PFC lesion correlating with a deficit of consciousness, right? So, I mean, you kind of have to make up your mind one way or the other here. If you want to go the route that you were floating a moment ago, then you kind of have to throw all that evidence out. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I'm not sure that seems fair.
Okay.
So, because the kinds of studies that we're talking about here, which I guess we could talk about the details if we really wanted to, but those kinds of things, what they're doing is estimating a metacognitive ability and then inferring a lack of consciousness from that. But
well, the studies kind of take a lot of different forms. I think the RONUS, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah,
I think that study takes that form. They might be inferring it from that, but there's a lot of ones where they just ask about visibility as well, straight up, which is to the credit of these, you know, these fantastic studies with the PFC. I mean, there's so many scientists that are taking seriously the idea of looking for phenomenological deficits. It's such a credit to their field, and it's such a boon to ours that they're carrying out these ingenious experiments in many cases. But that's a whole other can of worms there too. Inferring a lack of phenomenology from a lack of metacognitive sensitivity, that seems like kind of a leap to me.
Yeah, well, it depends on this kind of empirical link. So if you don't buy that, there's some evidence that suggests that the relevant areas which do the metacognition are also at least partially overlapping with areas that would be the higher order areas. But I think that, you know, people like Hak-Wan Lau and Roundness and those guys, that's where some of this evidence comes from, that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is often touted as being an important area here. Although there are other people who think that maybe the frontal pole and some other more medial areas are important. So it's not just the DLPFC, but that's a major area. But we think that area does have some role to play in these kind of metacognitive abilities, and also has been implicated in this kind of higher order awareness if it exists and is important for consciousness. So insofar there's a lack in one, you can infer a lack in the other, given that idea is crucially involved in both.
Yeah, but isn't that kind of assuming what you're setting out to prove? Am I missing something? So the idea is that you want to prove that the DLPFC is important for consciousness, and that there's a link with metacognition. Like, why is it important? Because it has to do with metacognition.
Well, no, there's one set of studies which talk about metacognition and focus, and the DLPFC seems to show a prominent role there. There's another set of studies that talk about visibility, and which we take to be an index for conscious experience, and DLPFC seems to be important there. So there seems to be some overlap in the machinery there, which then if you start to look at the metacognitive stuff in that light, then we start to say, oh, well, there's a deficit there. Maybe it's also the case that there's a deficit in the experience.
We've seen it confirmed over here that DLPFC damage creates conscious deficits. We've seen it also creates metacognitive deficits. You tie it all together. Yeah. Okay. Well, in any case.
Well, in any case, so that would be the argument for why it's what you were saying before isn't fair. That we can't, that we have to get rid of that sort of evidence if we want to accept the other kind of evidence.
Yeah, I guess you can allow that evidence to carry over. I don't consider it to be super strong.
Well, I don't think any of this evidence is super strong. I hope, yeah, we agree about that. So, I mean, the title of your paper, I mean, by the way, your paper's always titled something funny, but this underwhelming force, I agree with you that part of the argument is not especially strong at this point. But I don't think that's really, I mean, I think that those sorts, so I think putting it the other way, the point of all of this lesion PFC stuff is to counter the sorts of people, one of whom is you, who go around saying, oh, well, we have really good evidence that lesions to the PFC don't affect conscious experience. And then the response is, well, here's some evidence that In fact, maybe it does. So
Yeah.
it's not supposed to really support or prove higher order theory as being true, but more supposed to mitigate this claim from the opposing camp that, oh, we already know, like from the 30s even, that this doesn't play a role. So that, I think it's more, and in that realm, I think it actually does succeed. So, but I don't think it goes so far as to establish the
Yeah.
claim.
So if I'm, the format in which things make it into print, sometimes you have to be a little roughshod with the argumentative strategy. But the general, if I wanted to put it a little more carefully, I would say it doesn't help very much, like to show these very tiny deficits of consciousness, if they even exist. So if I if I had more room and could have tied the dialectic all together, what I'd say is that it doesn't really help to mitigate all the PFC stuff. All the PFC stuff where we don't see deficits in consciousness. So it's not an effective response to these other studies where we don't see deficits in consciousness when the PFC is damaged.
Well, so which studies are you talking about where we don't see deficits in consciousness?
I mean, there's like the people with DLPFC damage have been studied extensively in many cases. And they've never been shown to have the kinds of phenomenological deficits that for PFC, that higher order theory seems to have to predict.
But they're not really looking for that, and if they are looking for it, they're looking for behavioral deficits.
Yeah, so I'm going to have to. I was about to follow up with something to address what you're mentioning. The line of argument here would be that if you study a whole lot of people with DLPFC damage, and you never see any example of perceptual deficits or the person saying their phenomenology has changed in some way in the course of all that, this starts the accumulation of it starts to make it look like strong evidence against it. And the same thing can be said not just about the DLPFC, but the PFC in general. Why does that count as strong evidence eventually? I mean, all we're talking about here is an absence of evidence. Well, because at some point, the odds of the deficits being revealed in one of two ways seems to become very high when you have a lot of experiments. The first way in which it might happen is in the case of behavioral deficits. They stop being able to, and I'm going to address where, this is for people who are not caught up in the dialectic yet. So if someone lacks consciousness for some color out in their visual field, you might expect them to not be able to report on it, right? So that's one possibility there. Why can't the subject report what color you put in front of them? Because they're not conscious of it. Okay, so that's one way in which it might work. And that's sort of intuitive. But the higher order theorist is going to say, oh no, you might not have behavioral deficits. You're the first, because the first order states are still able to do all this stuff. So the person will be able to still name what color it is you put in front of them. Okay, but what happens when we end up in a scenario that starts to sound a bit like blindsight? You know, blindsiders, you ask them to name something, they say they can't see it, and yet they can still name what it is.
Right.
But blindsiders are a little puzzled at their ability to be able to do this. And it comes out, they express amazement at the fact that they can do so well at something, even though they can't see it. And so I would expect eventually you'd start to see people say, well, this is kind of odd. On this trial, I couldn't see it, but I was able to say what it was. Or even more generally, you bring someone in for testing because they've just had massive PFC damage. And when you do this, they run a huge battery of tests involving not just perceptual tasks, but all sorts of tasks that test perception indirectly. So if someone has to name colors, say what's going on in their visual field, read a whole bunch of passages in order to test their ability for theory of mind, run all sorts of examples where they have to constantly use their perceptions. And this is not that long after they've been damaged. It seems like they would notice something has happened to their phenomenology. Now, it's not definitely the case that they would, that you have, Fechschwanger, I think his name is, he did a study of like 200 World War I patients, all with PFC damage. It's possible that these people all had deficits in higher order states and had massive phenomenological deficits and they never mentioned it. It's possible.
Right.
But I mean, I think the needle starts to move more toward PFC theory, the probability of PFC theory going down. The more you look at people who have PFC damage and there isn't any revelations of these sorts of phenomenological deficits. And again, to tie things in a little bit, these people might show something like a 30% deficits in some sort of 30% deficit in an ability to do some sort of higher order function. You can use that kind of as an index of how much phenomenological deficits they would have as well. So you have all these people that have what seem to be large cognitive deficits, which seems to indicate that they'd have large phenomenological deficits, and yet none of them mention that something's gone on with their phenomenology. None of them have difficulty with performing perceptual tasks. None of them express amazement that the kind of amazement that a blindsighter would express at their ability to do things that that seems to it would require them to consciously see it, and yet they can't, and so on.
Yeah, no, so I agree that that's something that would cause you to want to do different sorts of tests. You would want to ask them more pointed questions. Because I just feel like when they do these studies, they're not really, I mean, some of the more current ones, when they do that, they do find some evidence that there's at least some change in their higher order awareness, or what we would call, visibility ratings or confidence judgments. But in these other studies, they don't really address those things. So it's not really, I mean, to come at it from a different way, if you think about something like aphantasia, which is the lack of mental imagery, people who have that don't know that they have it. They're very surprised when they find out, that there's something missing from their experience, which other people have. So unless it's really explicitly brought out, I just don't see, especially with the kind of damage that we're talking about in the areas, it would seem somewhat surprising if they did notice it. It would seem like, to the extent that the prefrontal areas which are involved in access are damaged, well, then you're going to have trouble accessing stuff. And so it doesn't really seem all that surprising that they don't notice.
Well, I mean, we're at a point at which we're looking at the body of evidence and having a different, all things considered, judgment.
Yeah.
It just, to me, it seems like there's been so many studies of prefrontal cortical damage and no evidence of the kind of deficits you would expect, that it starts to look like it's improbable that the theory would be correct. And just to add, you mentioned that, when they do specifically study it, they do see deficits in consciousness. And this ends up speaking to the issue about not the kind that I would expect. To tie it in with some of the thoughts I was expressing earlier on about using the amount of cognitive deficits as an index of how big the phenomenological deficits would be, if higher order theory is true. The Ronas et al. Study, I think they have something like a 35% reduction in metacognitive ability. And yet the deficit in consciousness that they find, what is it? Well, I hope I'm remembering the correct paradigm here. If it isn't, then it's going to be something equally underwhelming. I think it's you've got a square and a triangle, and they have to say whether the square was on the left or on the right. And so they get a little bit worse at that. No evidence for any other conscious deficits. No evidence for lost conscious states anywhere else in the visual field. No evidence even for lost conscious states at fixation at the areas that they're attending. Right. So it's not that they don't see the square or the triangle. They just can't say where the square and the triangle were. Right. It's not like they have a little phenomenological hole where those things were. They still see a color there. They still see a shape there, possibly. They still see a texture, things like that. They see, every sort of aspect of their phenomenal experience seems to be preserved in that part of their visual field, except maybe the shape of it. And so it's just like, if you take that and compare that to the massive amount of conscious experience they're having, with the colors, shapes, etc., displayed about their visual field, it seems like such a minuscule change that we have. And I would submit that you would expect something much larger when you have something that basically is taken away 35% of the cognitive ability that the person has that's related to higher order state production.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point. Related to this point, I know you don't really buy this redundant function argument that people like Hakwan and Knight and Odegaard.
Yeah.
So is that fair to say? Because I mean, a part of their claim is that, well, there's maybe a lot of redundant systems, and so maybe some other areas taking over this function, possibly not even in the prefrontal cortex. I mean, more likely than not, somewhere in there, but we can't really say that the brain seems to have massively redundant systems in it. And you dismiss that pretty quickly, as far as I can tell.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. In my humble opinion, I feel like they don't go much further than what you just said right there. They don't. They are yet to be able to point to studies that show massive amounts of. So if you look at this claim, what is usually used to back up to it is it's always the same study, which is a study by Wojciech et al.
Yeah.
Which shows that subjects who have, I think it's DLPFC damage unilaterally, when they carry out a task that puts demands on the DLPFC, the other DLPFC will show extra activation. So it seems to be like operating in a dynamic fashion. The thing is that in this study, they didn't measure whether it brought it up to a normal level of function, right? So if it was if the person was overall functioning at a 40% level of capacity, and now it's brought it up to a 60% level, we would still see a 40% reduction in the ability to produce higher order states and still rather large deficits of consciousness, right? And then this is really there isn't very much else that they present. And if you just look at neuroplasticity in general, it's the kind of thing that, first of all, it's way more effective in kids, and secondly, it's really rare that a person ever has a complete return to function.
Right.
It's more that it ameliorates. And not only that, many times, in many cases, there's what they refer to as compensatory masquerade, where they just learn how to do something different. And it's not that they have a different system that performs the same function. It's rather that they have a different function that is co-opted for carrying out the same task.
Right.
Which I don't know how naturally that would lend itself to the idea that, what we want is the former thing in the case of the higher order states being made up for. So this is where, and I think this is really where the most interesting part of the debate is going to be coming up here. If I'm correct, and I think that there's at least a prima facie reason to think that these deficits should be a little bit bigger, then the debate becomes like, well, how effective is neuroplasticity? Because if I'm a higher order theorist, I need it to be the case that it's going to be pretty effective if we're going to explain the lack of pretty substantial deficits. And so maybe the next interesting stage is to really investigate neuroplasticity and see whether it is up to the task of making up for the loss of function that happens when areas in the PFC are damaged. And not just neuroplasticity in general, but PFC plasticity in particular, in part because one of the claims that's made in the literature is that the PFC is much more plastic than other areas. Yeah. And I think there is good evidence for that. But is it plastic enough?
Is it plastic? Yeah, I mean, so this brings up the other thing I wanted to ask you about, which is the way that the way in which you postulate the relationship between conscious experience and the higher order states, which I think feeds into your claim that we don't find the kind of deficits that you would expect.
Yeah.
So at one point, it seems like you're taking on and you cite a couple of people, although I don't know about their pedigree with respect to higher order theory, but that there should be like one higher order state for every conscious episode. So if I'm seeing a red round square, there's got to be a higher order state that represents the redness, the roundness, and the squareness. So that's 3 states right there altogether for one
approximation. Yeah, go ahead.
Is that the way you're thinking about this?
So that is the way that I sustain the dialogue throughout the paper. But and this gets into the mereology of higher order states. But it's kind of like I don't know exactly how to count higher order states, but it seems to me like unless you're going to adopt something like a pointer theory, which
I'm
Hawking
sympathetic to that. Yeah, I'm sympathetic.
which are not ascendant at this point. It seems like you kind of have to have some part of the higher order state that corresponds to whatever content is going to be conscious. And I mean, this seems especially true with a view like yours, where the phenomenally conscious states are all coming from the PFC. Like
Right.
you're going to, if you're going to have a conscious experience of an ice cream cone with with flecks in it, put it in front of a blue expanse and so forth, and there's someone over here standing, you're going to need a little bit of content for each of those parts of it. And so I always felt a little bit funny talking about this like sort of like 1-to-1 ratio. But the thing I want to convey is that you're going to, the higher order thoughts, in some sense, unless you go with one of these pointer theories, which I'm not sure I understand how they work yet, the higher thought's going to need to get bigger and bigger the more phenomenology there is. And that's going to require more and more cognitive resources. And that means the more cognitive resources that are lost, the smaller the higher order state's going to have to get.
Yeah.
But I break it up into 1-to-1 because it's kind of a convenient way to run the dialogue in the article. But we could talk about like your sort of theory would lend itself very well to this, in that we could just talk about how when damage happens, certain components of the higher order state are going to be lost.
Right.
Because efficiency is lost and effectiveness is lost.
Yeah, I don't think.
To follow up on your question.
Yeah.
I'm trying to clarify like how I don't want to be like so wed to that way of understanding, because it's very weird to talk about it that way, but I think it helps to convey what the idea is behind the whole argument.
Yeah, good. Okay, because I find that very implausible, that there would be a 1-to-1, like that's too many thoughts, too many higher order states. So, I split my views around, so I don't have any like one view that I'm like 100% committed to, but I have credences distributed in various places. I even have some credences in first order views. If I were going to be a first order theorist, I'd be like someone like Bloch, as opposed to someone like Tai or anyway. So I have some sympathy even with those sorts of views. However, the way that so this is an issue. First of all, let me say I don't think this issue gets enough attention. So I'm glad that you brought it up so that we could talk about it, because it everyone talks about simple examples like I am seeing red, or I am whatever, having these simple states, and it's obviously much more complicated than that. So the only person that's ever really talked about this is Carruthers, Peter Carruthers, and he's trying to make an argument against the traditional higher order view that there's too much cognitive states. But so one of the issues here is whether you're a rich theorist or a sparse theorist with respect to phenomenal consciousness. So I know someone like David Rosenthal is much more into the sparse side of the camp. So he denies that the kinds of contents of these higher order states are going to be very rich or detailed. They're going to be often comparative. And so the kinds of contents are going to be generally, for normal conscious experience, going to be generally very sparse. I find that view kind of surprising, but I mean, I can wrap my head around it.
It's a way of solving the problem. It's a way of evading this. It isn't actually, but it looks like a way to evade it.
Yeah. Well, what do you mean by it isn't actually?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd rather let you finish your thought, and we can come back to that.
Okay. Well, I mean, so the other half of the thought was that if you think that the experience is very richly detailed, which I tend to sometimes think, and in fact,
Yeah.
I'm involved with this Templeton thing with Ned Block and David Chalmers and a bunch of other people who are trying to test this stuff actually, and I do have some allegiance to the idea that conscious experience is rich, and you would expect it to be in the prefrontal cortex. We're actually trying to think about how you could test that stuff. So there, I don't think that you're going to get a bunch of different thoughts, though. I think you're going to get, who knows how many. It's hard to count thoughts, but the contents are going to be rich. That's where the action is in the contents of the thought. And so, and they can sweep together many first order states at the same time. Describing in a swath of these states, I'm seeing having in a state with this kind of content. And so there, I think that the kind of argument that you present doesn't get as much traction, because you're not going to expect the same sorts of deficits that you expect. And in fact, it may just be that what happens is the content gets a bit sparser because you're not able to generate, you don't have as much capacity to generate the contents, as opposed to missing actual the thoughts. So you're going to have experiences with more sparse contents, which, I mean, we have some reason to think you wouldn't notice if the sparse theorists are generally correct and your experience is already sparse in the first place, and you don't really notice that. I mean, we're sort of under this impression that it's very richly detailed, and if we're wrong about that, then it would be surprising for us to notice that. So I think that this it highlights the assumption that you're making that we would expect a certain kind of deficit, which would be like, you know, closer to the phenomenological blindness side of the scale, as opposed to just a sparser kind of dialing down of the content, a degrading of the content. So how do you think your argument would work in that case?
Yeah, I don't, so I mean, so there's the point about understanding it in terms of content rather than the higher order states. But then you also brought in the idea that, well, if it's just sparser, then people are less likely to notice it.
Yeah.
So on the first point, I'm entirely comfortable with putting it in terms of content, and I feel like it works just as well, and I will explain why.
Okay.
So you have a theory of let's say you have a theory of consciousness, a higher order theory that says that the content of experience is entirely determined by the higher order state, something like your theory or Rosenthal's theory. So you're having an experience of a red square on a blue expanse. Now it's the brain is damaged, and all you can do is what you were working with before is one higher order thought. So there's only ever one higher order thought. What was happening was the red square on the blue expanse. Now it's damaged, and you get just the blue expanse, right? So it seems like the same sort of argument is still going to work here. And I gave a toy example here, but now we've got a rich phenomenology, and we'll discuss sparseness in a moment. You've got a rich phenomenology. You're in a stadium and you're seeing people everywhere, and myriad colors and shapes and motions and so forth. It's not all one higher order thought. It gets damaged. Now you don't see as many the color of many people's faces. You don't see as much motion. You don't see as much of the other aspects of the experience that you would have looking out in the stadium. So it's like it all comes down to cognitive efficiency or effectiveness, if you will. As long as we have a decline in cognitive effectiveness, then we're going to see parts of the phenomenology drop out. So that's to just address your first point,
right.
About how it doesn't. I don't think there's any difference if we get away from my toy model of one-to-one sort of a relationship. Now, if we want to talk about the sparseness thing, well, I mean, do you want to interject on that before?
I'll let you finish, and then I'll interject.
Okay. So as far as the sparseness goes, I think to present the dichotomy as rich versus sparse is a little bit misleading, because it's kind of like saying, well, look at this CAO, he's dirt poor because he's not as rich as Warren Buffett, right? Like, so the idea here is that even if you can get things down as skinny as the sparse theorists want to make it, still actually a lot of content there. Like, examine your visual experience just in the phobia. There's like thousands of points of colors right there that are being filled in. And that's all going to have to show up in the higher order thought in some sense. And then you've got other aspects, like whether it's moving or something like that, about what its texture is. And this is just all in one modality, right? So I think even if it's relatively sparse, and I don't think that sparse theorists are correct, you're still going to have a lot of higher order state acreage in order to fill out the conscious experience. And I mean, we can go through a lot of the experiments and say why I don't think they work, but for the time being, I'll just say that I don't think a lot of experiments are even very good for showing that the experience is that much less rich than we pre-theoretically take it to be.
So, so I guess it depends on what you think antecedently about things like subjective inflation. If you think that that's a live possibility, that people systematically misjudge how rich their conscious experience is, or that they experience things. I mean, so that not just misjudge it, but that they experience things as having a lot of detail when the detail's not there. So I think that these, this is one of the other things we're looking at in the Templeton thing I mentioned before, is whether you can duplicate this. And I know it's tricky. It doesn't work in every modality, and they don't always find it when they look for it. But there is some evidence that I would say suggests that people experience things as having a lot of detail, which isn't there. So that the thing that you were talking about, all the colors and the millions of points, you may be having a higher order state which says something to the effect of, there's a lot of detail here, without actually representing all the detail. And yet you would experience it as being very detailed, just not in detail.
You're getting tricky with the language here. I don't think you would experience it as detailed. You would have a belief that it was detailed. You would have a belief that your experience was detailed, but you wouldn't actually experience it as detailed.
Well, I actually think you would experience it as detailed, but just not in detail. So the experience would be as of a very detailed scene, but without the details.
That sounds like a mistaken belief to me, as opposed to an experience. But let's not get hung up on that particular word.
Well, there's some reason to think it's not just a mistaken belief, because, like, for example, in these studies that, I'm talking about the ones that come from Hoffman's lab and related areas, but they try to train away these kind of cognitive biases by coaching them, giving them feedback trial by trial, by giving them incentives to judge in various ways, and it doesn't go away, which seems like it's a perceptual effect. So it's subjective inflation, if it's a real thing, is inflation at the experiential level, not at the judgment level.
I'm really confused now. So the claim is that those experiences are not as rich as they are.
They're, it's like if I told you a story and I said, there was a crowded city street. And then, okay, but I didn't tell you about every person on the street or what they were wearing or anything like that, but I just give you the sense that there's a lot of detail there. Well,
in that case, though, you're not actually experiencing it. You're not actually experiencing a crowded street.
No, but that's the sort of representational content that we're positing in the experience, in the higher order state, which was subsuming the experience or related to it. So, that's one of the benefits of having intentional theories. Intentional content can be as vague or general as you like, as opposed to pointer theories and those sorts of things. So,
I'm seeing what you're saying with experiencing it as. I've got doubts whether experiencing something as something, even as phenomenologically manifest, if you know what I mean.
Well, I don't know what you mean.
Okay. Well, if you experience if you experience a gorilla, you can experience its color, you can experience its shape, you can experience its motion. And then there's a question about whether you experience it as a gorilla, whether there's something that's like to see something as being something of a type.
Right.
I take it that we all think there's something that's like to see a color and see a shape and so forth. Like, that's phenomenological manifest. But there's a live debate about whether there's something that's like to see something as belonging to a certain category.
Yeah, I don't think that's what I'm talking about. So I'm thinking about things like the Sperling case, the Sperling sort of thing. You flash a bunch of letters on the screen. People sometimes say, although there's interesting paper that just came on this, but people sometimes say, I feel like I saw all the letters. And it may just be the case that they experienced something which we would describe as a bunch of letters without actually representing the details of which letter.
So do you truck it all with the idea that there are things that we can kind of like have as a part of our? There's debates about whether whether we can, when we can phenomenologically see something as changing, right?
Right.
Like it might be that we can, in some sense, see change without it being phenomenologically manifest.
Right.
In some sense, we can see something as being see something as a gorilla without that being phenomenologically manifest. And I'm just saying that whatever is being spoken of here as seeing something as being a bunch of letters might fall on the side of like it's not actually phenomenologically manifest. In which case,
I mean, that would be a pretty strange claim, given that, you know, I've been in seeing these stimuli in it. I'd swear what I'm seeing is a bunch of letters. That's what I experience, is a bunch of letters on the screen. But the question is whether
I could say the same thing about the gorilla. I swear I just saw a gorilla, and yet the claim could be true that all that I phenomenologically saw was its color and shape and so forth. In the case of the letters, all I phenomenologically saw was whatever letters I actually, the shape and color of whatever letters I actually were part of my experience. And then that thing where I saw things as being a bunch of letters, that's actually not phenomenologically manifest.
So let me try to put this in a different way. Then you may consciously experience some shapes, but not specific shapes.
No, I tend to think that if you actually experience a shape, it has an actual shape to it.
Well, that's an assumption, though. So what I'm suggesting, though, is that there is some reason. So this is what subjective inflation is. If it's a real thing, then it's the sort of thing I'm describing, where you have an experience which is inflated in the sense of presenting itself to you in a way which suggests a bunch of detail, which actually is not actually part of the experience.
Yeah. So, and then we get to the claim that it's not that you're experiencing detail; you're experiencing it as detailed.
Well, I'm leaving the word "as" out, since I'll give you the claim that you were making before. So you don't experience it. I won't say that you experience it as detailed, but your experience is that there's a very detailed scene in front of you, but you actually don't experience the details.
Yeah. So, and I'm going to want to say that. How did you just put it? Experience it what?
You experience a very detailed scene being present without experiencing any of the details.
And that's the kind of, again, I'm going to say that I'm not sure that is phenomenologically manifest. Like you're using the word experience in a loose sense there, the same way that I experience the gorilla as being there, even though all I experience is color and shape and so forth.
So so you're going to deny so this is what started us off down this road, is that sounds like, so you deny subjective inflation is a real thing, but I haven't heard you like present a reason for thinking that it's not a real thing.
Well, I mean, it's not the way that I would usually deny it. And it's not even a way that I want to be married to in any sense. I was opening up a different question here about when you start talking about experiencing something as detailed, whether that actually counts as phenomenological experience.
So I left out the word "as" just for that reason. So you experience some detailed shapes being present, but there's no details in the experience. It's just detailed shapes. There's shapes.
When you use the word experience, you're using it in a different sense from phenomenological experience.
No,
that's what I'm saying.
There's no reason to think that.
What?
There's no reason to think that.
Well, I mean, you could deny it in the case of the gorilla as well. You could deny it in the case of change, but I mean, those are all options.
I'm not sure I'm following the rhetoric here. So there's some evidence which suggests that what I'm saying actually occurs, and you're saying it doesn't. So how do you deal with the evidence then?
Yeah. Okay. So let's get back on track, because we're getting into some fine-grained, obscure issues, and I feel like we're not keeping them carefully distinguished. It's probably my fault. But
no, I'm sure.
Let me give you what my more direct answer is to the subjective inflation stuff.
Yeah.
I confess to not being intimate with each and every study, but the ones that I've looked at, they often appear to me to not show that there are elements of a person's experience that are missing, but rather they show that people are not necessarily correct as to what is in their experience. So some of those studies, I believe they show a person to be more overly confident about what is occurring in their peripheral vision.
Yeah.
Right. So they show that the person thinks they're right about what is happening there, even though they're not. And that is the evidence for subjective inflation in some of these cases. But what they don't show is that there's a lack of experience there. So
well, no one's claiming there's a lack of experience. They're claiming that the experience is not as detailed as the subject experiences it.
So if you
phenomenologically, they're wrong. They have a sense that there's more there than is really there.
Yeah. So if you have a figure that is a set of dots, we have two, and it might be that the subject thinks that it's very fine grained, and there's a lot of detail to it. And what it turns out is that, so according to the subject, the dots are very small. But what the experiments show is that the dots are actually pretty big. So there isn't as much detail as they thought. At the same time, you have to still fill out all that area of phenomenology. So in one of the subparts of this figure, instead of having an alternating row of, say, blue and yellow dots, you just have one big blue dot, right? But you still have to fill all that area in. And so if you have a higher order state that is saying that there is stuff in this certain part of the visual field, you're going to need to fill that whole thing out. The higher order thought is going to need to be as big as it is needed to fill out that area of the visual field. It doesn't change.
Just filled it out by saying there's stuff there.
What?
That's filling it out.
Yes.
So that's all you need.
What?
It's filled out by simply the thought having the content. There's stuff there.
It's so break your phenomenology down into coordinates.
Yeah.
So let's look at the fovea. Let's say where people are mistaken about what's happening in their fovea. The fovea, is 10 degrees across or somewhere around there. You're going to need a higher order state if you're going to have a color experience in that part of the visual field. You're going to need a higher order state that says that there's something here and there's something here and there's something here and there's something here and there's something there and something here. So you're going to need to fill it. If it's a very detailed picture, you're going to need 6 different areas that are filled out. In a less detailed picture, it's going to be one area, but the area actually ends up being the same size as those 6 smaller ones. And once you have this, you're going to still need enough of a higher order thought to fill it out. Like, so now if you take a higher order state and you just have one that has a smaller amount of content, now you end up just filling out one of those 6 areas as opposed to the whole thing. So
or you just gloss over the whole area. So, I mean, if the higher order thought just says there are some colored circles, then you're going to experience there being colored circles without experiencing any of the particular colors. And that may be all you need. And you wouldn't notice anything weird about it. That's just that's until you tried to access it or say more about what color was there, you wouldn't notice anything strange about it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems possible that we have areas in our visual field that don't have a definite color.
Yeah. So, but
I don't think that those experiments are capable of showing that, because all they show is that people are like mistaken about what color is there. They're not necessarily mistaken about there being a color represented there. Now, like, so let me just, the way that these experiments would be most favorable to it, and I'm not saying that it necessarily doesn't support the view the way it is, but if you could somehow show that the subject just doesn't have a color experience at all there, that'd be very favorable to subjective inflation. It turns out that what is it like in most parts of our visual field most of the time? Because sparse theory is true. It's kind of like what it's like for us behind our head. There's nothing it's like for us to have something.
That was sparse theorists say. But hold on, so we're missing a little bit of what the dialectic here is, because I wasn't really trying to defend the sparse view right now. I was saying that, if someone like me who thinks there's this rich view, and it's all in the prefrontal cortex, and then you have some damage to the prefrontal cortex, and then you say, well, you don't notice it, you don't have any phenomenological manifestation of it, and people don't say anything about it. At which point I was postulating that there would be a kind of degrading of the contents into a sparse kind of content in those particular cases, not in the normal case. So it might be the case that when you have the damage to the prefrontal areas that give you the 35% reduction, what happens is not that you lose conscious experience, but just becomes more degraded, more sparse. In which case it would be more like the subjective inflation stuff that we're talking about, which normally is, we're talking about it's over here in the periphery. And people, the key claim there is that people say it's more visible than what's in their focal area. They say that was the more visible thing. And they're highly confident about what judgments they're making. They're wrong or they're right. Their performance is not in any way tracking their confidence levels or their visibility ratings. They're just as good in the other areas. And so there's some reason to think that their experience is actually inflated beyond what's the detail, which is actually encoded in that area by the relevant first order states. So, but they don't notice it. In fact, they're more confident about it. So if something like that which normally doesn't occur in the foveal areas, a normal experience, something like that may be what's accounting for these PFC deficit things that we were talking about before. That was why I brought all that stuff up, was a way of suggesting that the way that you would expect the deficits to manifest is not exactly the way like a higher order theorist like me at least would expect them to manifest. That was what the force of that was supposed to be. So I'm not suggesting that we actually have that in the focal vision right now in our foveal areas. I don't think that's the case, but I do think that maybe in the periphery it is the case.
Mm-hmm. I think I think one of the sticking points here is that I'm not sure if I completely understand what a less detailed experience is supposed to be like. I get the sense that there is a definite color represented throughout my visual field at each point.
Yeah.
I don't understand what it would be.
But that's exactly what it's like. What it's like is that you have the sense there's a definite color, even if there isn't one. You just described it.
Yeah, so my belief could be mistaken.
It's not a belief, it's the experience.
Yeah, I just don't think it quite accounts for what it is that I'm talking about.
What you're talking about is the phenomenological sense you have that there's a definite color represented at each, or experienced at each point in your visual field, which is what it's like. That's the way you experience it.
Yeah, it sounds like a belief to me. It doesn't sound like I don't know. Maybe we're at a sticking point of the dialectic. I'm not quite. I'm not.
Well, the reason for
wrapping my mind around this idea of experiencing it as without it actually having a definite sort of with it being phenomenologically manifest and it's still deserving the name experiencing as.
Well, when no one's saying experiencing as, I didn't realize that would be a trigger for you. So I retracted that way of putting it and have not been putting it that way.
Uh-huh.
So if that's a problem, then it's not that you experience it as, it's just that what you experience is a definite color at each point in your visual field. But there are certain areas that are not definitely phenomenologically colored in, so to speak. But you experience you have a sense that there's a definite color in each part of your visual field, when that's just not the case. That's inflation of perception. And you may find that hard to believe, but I mean, that's fine. But there's some evidence which suggests that it's perceptual, it's a perceptual phenomena, which is that you can't train people out of it. No matter how much you try to incentivize them or give them feedback, they still have, it doesn't affect their sense that they're more confident about the judgments in the periphery, that they they rate those things as higher in visibility. And it's both of those things together which really do the work.
I'm not getting the connection between them being mistaken about what's in their periphery and the idea that there's actually no experience in that part of the visual field where they're mistaken about something.
But Benji, hold up, there is experience in that part of the visual. It's just, it's inflated. It's not as detailed as one.
It's completely obscure to me, the idea that there's experience there, but yet there is not actually, the idea of inflation is obscure to me in this sense.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say. It's a theoretical posit based on these kinds of.
I'm not getting the motivation on the basis of these experiments. I'm not getting the motivation for this particular theoretical posit just on the basis of these experiments.
The motivation is that, well, the subjects say things like it's more visible, and yet their performance is not affected. They say things like they're more confident about whether the grading is left tilted or right tilted. Or
I don't understand how that leads to it not being detailed.
It leads to it not being detailed. Well, in this case, it would be that there's less detail than the so.
Right. So it leads to the conclusion that it's not detailed.
Well, if you can't say if you are at performance not any better or worse about saying whether the patch is left tilted or right tilted, and yet you're saying that it's more visible and that you're more confident, then there's something going on there. And now it may just be a judgment that you're making, which is mistaken. But if you train them, give them feedback trial by trial, incentivize them with money, and it still doesn't go away, which you would expect that it would go away under those circumstances if it were merely a cognitive thing, then those two lines of evidence suggest that it's the experience itself which is inflated, not the belief that's inflated.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the reasoning. I'm not connecting the last couple dots here. Why would it favor the experience actually being this strange, non-detailed sort of entity that I have trouble wrapping my mind around, as opposed to just saying people are overconfident about what is going on in their experience in that part of the visual field?
Because you would expect that you could train it out of them if it were just merely a cognitive thing. I mean, if you have a bias or a tendency to judge a certain things, I mean, you can't train someone not to see the Mueller-Lyer illusion, no matter how much training you give them, how much money you give them, they're going to experience the two lines as being unequal. You can't change that because it's a perceptual effect. So the reasoning here is that since this seems sort of resistant to those kinds of methods, then we would expect that it's a perceptual effect, not merely a cognitive effect.
Mm-hmm.
So you say it's more visible, but it clearly isn't more visible. You say you're more confident that you got it right, but you have no reason to be more confident that you got it right. So there's something about your experience which is suggesting to you that you should be more confident and that it's more visible, when in fact it isn't.
Yeah, well, I'll have to chew it over, Richard.
Okay, but so if you, I mean, this is, yeah, so if you bought this line of reasoning, then the response I was giving before would be more plausible, because it does seem that the way that you expect the deficits to manifest is kind of already denying the sorts of things that the higher order theorist thinks are true. So that's part of the problem, I think, with the argument that you were giving, is that you have these assumptions, which really are first order assumptions about the way conscious experience would manifest and the way we would have access to it and so forth and so on. And you build that into your argument, which then, not surprisingly, makes the higher order theory look bad, because you've already built in some assumptions which are anti-higher order theory.
Mm-hmm. Possibly.
Yeah, possibly. Okay, so I mean, whatever, we'll have to talk about that more, and maybe, maybe this is, anyway, maybe it's not a coherent idea. I actually think that it is, and I think that inflation is kind of an important idea, but let's talk about the pointer view for a second, if you don't mind, because you were saying a bit ago that you're, I guess, Well, I'm not sure what you said. You said that you don't understand the point of view or how it works or what it says in these sorts of cases. Is that?
Yeah, I don't. It's if you could explain to me how it works, maybe I would be able to wrap my mind around it. But the general idea is that there's somehow a higher order state is tagging a lower order state.
Yes.
What is involved in tagging?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So some people think that the idea of tagging doesn't make any sense, but I mean, the way, at least that I think about it, is in terms of just specifying an address where you would find the first order state. So, if I say, you're going to find Benji at this address, and I write down the address, then in essence, I've pointed to where you live. And in computer science, we can say, well, in this data sector or this, you're going to find these states which you're interested in. And so that's really, I think, all that you need. There's an address, and the higher order state basically says, at this address, there's a veridical perception. And then the state becomes conscious as a result of that.
I mean, it sounds okay to me.
Okay. So, but how is your argument here? So would you agree that the kind of things that we've been talking about don't address that kind of view?
Oh, well, you're going to, so here's one way it could work. So how do you tag these states? Well, I have one state that says visual cortex or says visual states. Like, is that all the level of detail we need for everything to become conscious?
Yes. It just says, in this region, you'll find something veridical, or you'll find something internally generated, or you'll find the activity from this address is noise, ignore it. The activity from this address is
right. So we need more than one address, right?
Yes, we need all the addresses for the relevant areas of the cortex.
Yeah. So the thing that's nice about this view is it doesn't require a duplication of content the way that like a view like yours does, which runs. Well, you're going to, for everything that's in your experience, you're going to need to have the content represented in the PFC.
It's not a duplication of content, since one's conceptual and one's not. So you're not duplicating the whatever first order representations. You're re-representing them, but you're not duplicating them. So I think that the claim that it's duplication is already a bit of.
Okay, well, so if you have a conscious experience of like some rich scene, you're going to need all that content in the PFC.
Yes.
Okay, that's all I wrote. And in many cases, what's going to happen is going to be duplicated from what's happening in the visual cortex. Nothing hangs on us, though.
It's going to be a redescription of it, but it's a description of it in some sense, but not duplication of it.
Okay. So the nice thing is that you don't need to have all the content in the PFC, because there are reasons. I mean, I don't. It seems like at any moment we can go down a rabbit hole here. But the reason is because maybe someone wouldn't think a rich experience would all be bothered to be represented by the PFC, right? So let's just throw that out there, and we can come back and hash that out if we want. But that seems to be one advantage that the pointer view might have.
Right.
But if you're going to have to tag things, and the visual experience is pretty rich, you're still going to have to do a lot of tagging.
Yes.
So for each point in the visual field you're experiencing a color, you're going to need one tag. It doesn't seem to evade the argument I'm presenting all that well, in that you're going to have a decreased ability to tag things as you have the prefrontal cortex damaged, and thereby end up with a decreased phenomenology.
Yeah, so I know, I think Hakwan and people who like this perceptual reality monitoring view kind of go back and forth on this, because in some of his phases, what he says is, look, we're having a criterion that's set. And so if you have lower activity, you wouldn't expect like lower, this is one of the ways he responded to people like Miguel Sebastian when he talked about, dreaming and the DLPFC being sort of underactivated in the case of dreams. And then people, Huckman says, well, we wouldn't expect lower activity there to mean less higher order states. It just means that there's a lowering of the criteria so that it's easier to cross the threshold from this is noise to this is veridical. And so then that's kind of what you would expect in those kinds of cases, is that you would get conscious experiences generated more freely in a sense, because you don't have the ability to set the criteria up super high. So in that sense, I think that he's not going to say that it's a tag for everything, but that there's a threshold that needs to be crossed in order to be sort of counting as vertical. But in some of his other areas where he's written about this, it does sort of seem like there would be a tag for every point. So I'm actually not sure what to make of what.
Yeah, I think I don't rule out it could be spelled out in a way that's much more. That my argument is less damaging toward it, which is why I started with the idea that you just have one tag, and then it says what's happening in the visual cortex. It's labeling that, and that's all you need in order to get the conscious experience, the rich conscious experience. Maybe my argument wouldn't work very well against a view like that. Of course, that view is going to have its own problems, but because we are thinking that everything that becomes conscious is probably going to need to be tagged,
right,
to the fine grainedness of whatever the experience turns out to be.
Yeah. So, but if it were just a criteria setting thing, then the argument wouldn't really.
Well, do you need to run each experience through the gauntlet that's going to be a part of the rich visual experience, though? Like, if you have to do that, if you have to run each thing through, then it seems like you're going to run into the same problem.
Well, on that way of thinking about things, what you have is you have activity in the visual cortex, for example, and then you have a system which is kind of monitoring it to determine whether it's accurately representing something in the environment, or whether it's internally generated, or whether it's just noise. And so there's a threshold at which it would have to cross in order to count as, it generated from the external environment. And there's kind of almost a priori argument that you get for this, right? Because neurons are always firing, they're never silent. So you need some way of determining whether the firing is representing something or if it's just kind of noise, just a general background activity of the neuron. So that's the job of this monitoring system, which is postulated to be in the prefrontal cortex, which is in some way tuned into what's going on down there. So that the activity, but you still need some way to say where the activity is, and that's the address point, I guess. So that you still need a way to tag it.
Yeah. It's in some ways you're not only tagging it, you're also labeling it. Like it's here, and it's also a good representation.
Yeah, it has to be. Well, it has to be that. Yeah, there has to be something that labels it. I think he's backed off a little bit, but at least when we wrote the paper that came on the Block anthology, he was open to the idea that it would be labeled as, veridical or intense or something like that. And he's backed off that to, it's kind of just there's 3 slots that it can be in. It can be in veridical, it can be internally generated, it can be noise. And I'm a little bit less clear about how that part of it works, although I know it's inspired by this adversarial sort of computer science-y type stuff where they're, the general adversarial network, the GANs. I don't know if you've read that stuff or up on this stuff or not, but anyway. So
yeah,
that,
I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah. Say again?
I know I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah. It's, it's inspired by the idea that if you want to train an artificial neural network to identify whether something's a cat or a dog, then you need the system which is generating the content, but then also a system that's trying to outwit it, that they're adversarial in a sense, that one's trying to generate fakes. And so that the system needs to be able to discriminate the fakes from the real ones, and then it does a better job at it. So that this is at least I'm probably butchering this idea, but that's part of the idea that is inspired his later views on this. But so, yeah, I guess even there, you wouldn't, the kind of deficits that you're going to expect, though, given damage to the prefrontal cortex, don't look like the kinds that you get or that you predict in the paper. You wouldn't expect a loss of the relevant higher order states, you would expect an inability to determine whether something was internally generated or noise or not, or vertical.
That is the higher order state in this theory, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. Maybe I might not have followed you, but did you conclude by saying that that looks less susceptible to it?
Yeah, well, the kind of deficits that you predict, that you say higher order theories predict, don't, at least on the face of it, appear to me the ones that you would
Right.
get.
So so far it sounds like the exact same considerations would apply insofar as you can make less confidence judgments. And in the course of making less confidence judgments, you end up with a shrunken phenomenology. So, the higher order theory, it says that higher order thought theory, every time you have a part of your phenomenology filled out, it's because you have a higher order state that is pointed at it, or a higher order state that has it as part of its content, or this or that. According to the Lau type theory, every time you have a part of your phenomenology filled out, it's because you've got some confidence judgment filled out about that perceptual state that would represent that, is going to manifest that part of phenomenology. And so to the degree that you lose the ability to create these confidence judgments, you would lose a corresponding ability to have phenomenal experience.
Right. Or you would just lose the ability to set this thresholds at a certain level, so that you would expect, some kind of erroneous judgments about whether it was internally generated or externally generated, which it doesn't seem like you would expect holes in the phenomenology, so to speak, so much as misjudgments about where the thing was.
So the person, what is going on here? The criterion gets dropped. So now things that, it used to be that it needed to have a threshold of X before it would be admitted. Now it needs I think that's my messages notification or something.
Oh, okay. It's like that hot one snapping me from afar. No, wrong.
So now it can be a crappier representation, and it gets labeled as being vertical.
Yeah.
And so now you just end up with, maybe you end up with more phenomenal experience?
Maybe, yeah, exactly, like in dreams.
You end up with more phenomenal experience in dreams?
More vivid, wild, like things that
Right.
wouldn't.
I mean, now dream is a very personal thing, but dreams, I think for most people, they're less vivid.
Well,
Like so I mean, for example, a lot of people dream in black and white. So
I don't believe that. No one dreams in black and white.
Okay.
But so in a dream, things which you would normally judge as being internally generated or mistaken as being out there, experienced as vertical, things which activity which may just be noise is misinterpreted as being
right. So here's a very small conscious experience I have experienced just in phobia, right? And that's all the phenomenal experience I have. In the case of a dream, it appears to me like my visual field is just, it's possibly just as wide as my regular visual experience. Right. It doesn't appear to be any wider. The thing that's different is the content itself is wider.
Right.
Like, so it's not all of a sudden I start seeing two objects in one part of the visual field, whereas I don't do that in regular visual experience, which I consider to be a bona fide increase in content. And the reason that I want to say that, if anything, it seems like it has, it's less of a conscious experience, is because the vivacity is lost the same way that in a memory, things seem more faint. Right. So on the one hand, the content is probably about the same amount. On the other hand, it seems like has less vivacity. So the idea that, so it's like the range of content might go all over the place, but the amount of content at any one given moment, it seems to me stays probably about the same. Right. Does that make sense?
Let's accept that and then say, but it's the range of the content, which is So the lowering of the threshold explains why the content is all over the place and there's no connection between it in a sense, because there's just all this randomly generated activity, which is now crossing the threshold, which normally wouldn't.
Right. So I mean, we have a distinction here now between differences in content and increases in content. I see that what's going on in the dream is just differences in content, but not an increase in the overall amount of content. So
Yeah, I'll give you that, yeah.
You see what I'm saying? I mean, this is there's not too much substantial hanging on this point. We got sidetracked by the idea about whether there's more content in a dream experience than a waking experience.
Yeah, no, that was a mistake. And the way you're putting it now, I agree with. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm not, it's nothing too much hangs on it, I think, as far as what we're discussing just before that.
Yeah.
But to get back to, 2 points back, 2 digressions back. So you get the distinction between increases and differences in content. Now the threshold is lowered, so it's admitting a lot more things. It's not just differences, it's more things are admitted at this point. So now it's almost like, to just give a toy example, you go from a visual experience that's just foveal to like, wow, it's huge. In our case, it goes from like whatever it is usually to like it being even bigger in some sense. And the bigger here is somewhat, it's somewhat metaphorical, not completely. It might be that it actually becomes bigger in the sense that the visual field becomes bigger, the perceived visual field, but it could also become bigger in the sense that now in any given part of the visual field, I maybe simultaneously experience 2 colors, right? Usually you just experience 1 color in any part of the visual field. Now the credence is, I think that's an interesting thing to discuss right there. But now it become much more commonplace that instead of just seeing blue in one part of the visual field, you might see blue and red in that very same part of the visual field at the same time, because the threshold has been lowered. So now you have these competing representations for what's being shown in the same part of the visual field, and they both are allowed admittance because of the lower threshold.
So is what you're saying here is that this is an objection to this view? Is that you would expect that kind of stuff, but we don't find it?
No, right now I'm at the stage of exploring what higher order theory, this version of higher order theory would say in the case of damage where there is a lower threshold for admittance.
Right.
So you'll remember there's one part of my paper I just asked the question, what should the higher order theorists say happens in cases of brain damage? And so this is just an exploration, but one that is much more geared to this particular theory, the pointer theory. Not only just specifically the pointer theory, but the credence, confidence sort of pointer theory.
Yeah.
Exactly. And now we can try and turn it into an objection, and I'm ready to do that now.
Okay. Go ahead.
We don't see that people start to have like multifarious colors represented in the same part of the visual field. They don't say that they start to see more overlapping things or the visual and expansion of the visual field and so on. I'm not saying this is a strong objection, but now we've got this prediction that maybe the content of the visual experience actually becomes greater because of the damage. But it's very interesting. Like if this is the right way, if this were the right way to interpret it,
right? We
get a reverse of what I was talking about in the article.
Yeah, exactly.
Submit with humility. This could turn into another way to object to higher order theory, more specifically this version.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know if it definitely is the case that there's maybe some reason to think that you get a reduction in conscious experience. I don't know if you would get the weird kinds of things that you're talking about, but that you would get more liberal judgments or about things which being visible or more confidence about what's there. And yeah, I don't know. So that's I don't know. So I don't know exactly what to say.
That last comment, were you specifically talking about the pointer theory, or are you talking about
pointer theory?
Okay.
Yeah.
So the idea here is that you're saying run it by me again.
Well, I wasn't really having a clear thought. I was just saying this is an interesting area that needs to be explored more.
You
But
can,
generally, the point that all this was kind of geared towards was trying to bring out the ways in which I think that you make assumptions about. I mean, you're the only one who's ever talked about this stuff, so it's good that you're at least saying something about it. But the way that you expect deficits to be manifest,
yeah.
given prefrontal damage, is not obviously the way higher order theorists would expect them to be manifest. And I think that's an important point.
Yeah, well, I mean, I greatly look forward to, a bit more, a very worked out version of what we've been gesturing at.
Yeah.
Because I think that'd be a great next stage in the dialectic.
Yeah, absolutely.
What a fleshed out version of the alternative view.
Right. And that's one of the, I mean, even though I don't agree with everything that you say, I think that's one of the important things about the kind of work that you're doing is it brings attention to these issues, and it shows that people need to say something about it, which no one has. I mean, there's kind of a lot of glib glossing over of these very technical issues and a lot of higher order theories.
Yeah.
Right.
A good philosophical papers can often contribute something section by section, and so my hope is that in the article that you just read, that the section in which I give an analysis of what the higher order theorists might say in the case of prefrontal cortical damage, I'm hoping that it helps to flesh out that issue, even for people who are committed higher order theorists.
Yeah.
Right? Well, okay, here's a way to think about it. Does this seem like the proper way to think about it? What are the other options now that we have this one fleshed out?
Right.
And so on.
Exactly. No, it does. I think that's one of the important contributions that the paper makes. And also just a careful working through of the various outcomes is also interesting and important. So I think, while I sort of have questions about the thrust of the argument, I'm not trying to disparage that you did the work. I think it's important and that it kind of
For the kindest of hosts.
needed to be done. What?
For the kindest of hosts, Richard. I mean, usually I get disparagement a go-go.
Yeah. I love you and your work, Benji. So I'm noticing we're getting on in time here, and I can't keep you forever, and I'm hearing stirrings because I always try to do this during nap time, and I'm hearing the kids stirring downstairs. So I wonder if there's anything which we haven't talked about, which you were hoping we were going to talk about, anything that hasn't come up, which you wanted to come up. And the answer can be no, but I just always like to check.
No, well, if it's something I'm curious as to what you think about. Because you have a predictable response, but so your theory, your version of higher order theory, and many versions of higher order theory that are going to tie the production of higher order states to the PFC has to potentially commit to the PFC containing all of the content that we consciously experience, right? And so let's just start at the case that's most friendly to the opponent of higher order theory, where experience is really rich. Like it's as rich as we ever thought it was, Like it's to every point of the visual field that we think has a color, motion, shape, texture represented it's there, and in all the detail we want. So now we have, and we're what I refer to as an upper deck theorist. So we think that all the content that is conscious is in the PFC.
Right.
There's a question as to whether it's plausible to think that the PFC would have this much content in it. So obviously we can thin down phenomenology, and that's the first move that's going to be made here with sparseness. But you've already said that you're sympathetic to richness, maybe not the vast richness that I just said, but you've still got a kind of rich picture. Like, how do you feel about the prospects for the PFC actually representing all of that?
Well, I think it's an empirical issue. So that, I predict that we should be able to decode that content from the PFC alone. And if we can't do that, then, so I would be abandoning that view. And that's in fact what we're looking at right now. But so it depends on how you decoded it. So if you're using fMRI, which I think is fairly crude, even with multivariate pattern analysis, I still think it's fairly crude. And people put too much faith into fMRI, I would personally say. And what you want is single cell recordings. And there's some evidence that we are able to decode contents of what we think of as perceptual experiences. I mean, they've done this in rats and monkeys and stuff. And even of stimuli which are not being attended, you can still decode the content so that it's not a matter of them paying attention to it or something like that. So my prediction, what I would expect, so my ultimate answer is that conscious experience is as rich as it is. I believe it's pretty rich, and I could be wrong about that, but I do have feelings that it's rich. And I think that a priori it would be very surprising if it were all in the prefrontal cortex, but there are a lot of things which are surprising a priori, which turn out to be the case. So my money is on this as an empirical issue. And what we want to be able to do and show is that that content is there, and we have tools for kind of doing that. And to the best of our ability at this stage in time, it may not be perfect, but I'm not going to really pin a lot on how implausible it is or anything like that. I want to see the empirical work being done. And if we can't decode it, then I'll say, yeah, I guess I was wrong about that. It would weaken my credence in this tremendously.
Yeah. So your prediction would be that so, and this is a technological prediction, because if it wasn't, then this wouldn't be able to be completely empirically tractable.
Right.
So I've got one little point in my visual field off to the right, midline. Eventually, we'll be able to decode what color is being represented in that particular part of it.
Yes, absolutely.
So.
And even better, we'd be able to stimulate it the right way and produce experience as of that exact shade of color just by stimulating the prefrontal cortex.
We'd be able to reproduce it by stimulating the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's.
There is some evidence that happens, by the way. So Tony Rowe has done TMS on the prefrontal cortex, and you get phosphenes, and he argues that it may be feedback through the visual, through the nerves to the visual cortex that's producing the phosphenes, which is a possibility, obviously, but it also is a possibility that stimulating the prefrontal cortex in the right way generates the experience. So I think those two things are really the future of this kind of work.
Did Rowe target areas that they knew dealt with vision in the PFC?
What do you mean by dealt with vision? That they're, yeah.
I mean, it could be that there's, and I don't think this is the way the PFC works, but if the PFC had certain areas that were dedicated to processing visual information, to targeting that, and then hitting it with the TMS and seeing the phosphenes.
Yeah, I forget where, in fact, they targeted. I'd have to check the details. So I don't.
But here's just, I mean, it's not. The discussions are often limited to vision, with good reason, because we just know so much more about vision and other modalities. But the question I was going to ask is whether you get auditory phosphenes when you do this, whether you get tactile phosphenes when you do this.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. That's exactly the right kind of question.
Yeah. And it's kind of curious to me, like, as to why we wouldn't. I guess it could just be there's more access to vision by the PFC than other modalities.
I mean, I think there's something to this idea, which Hawkman talks a lot about, but it's that the PFC is hard to play. It's hard to stimulate in the right way because of the way the neurons there function, and the visual cortex is a lot easier to stimulate and get the kinds of his analogy between a trumpet and a piano. So it's easy to bash the keys on a piano and get the notes from it. It's hard to do that with a trumpet because you got to blow it in the right way, and you got to have the embouchure, and so it's more than just hitting the keys.
Yeah.
And the prefrontal cortex is more like the trumpet in this respect, and the visual cortex is more like the piano. So in some sense, it's not that surprising that when we TMS, we get phosphenes in the visual cortex, and it's harder to do that in the prefrontal cortex because it's,
And it can also be the case that in the PFC, the same neurons that, a set of neurons that represent some feature on one occasion it might be the case that it's a different set of neurons that represent the very same feature on another occasion.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
like, there's kind of like this very spontaneous plasticity that can occur.
Exactly.
PFC.
And one neuron may be involved in multiple. I mean, so maybe you stimulate it one way and you get the visual phospheme, you stimulate it another way and you get the auditory phospheme.
So anyway,
what the right way to do it is. So
I'll just say that because of this, it might be hard to actually empirically get as far as that you're saying, as far being able to empirically confirm to the degree that you're talking about. But putting that aside, it seems to me that there's theoretical reasons to think that the PFC would not be in the business of representing this much content that's carried out by the rich. Sorry, it's getting to be. We've been talking for a long time.
yes.
Still putting together the thoughts, and the coffee's running low. So the PFC, it seems like in general, what the PFC is in charge of doing is not taking the mass amounts of sensory stimuli that we have and just taking it all in. It's more like selecting a subset. The function of it is to select a subset for more intense kinds of processing. And so like the job of the PFC is not to reduplicate, I'm sorry for that word, but I don't have another one right now, all the content that's in the lower sort of sensory areas to the point where we'd have this rich visual experience. And not only rich visual experience, but rich sensory experiences in all the other modalities. It's rather, its job is to just pick out a small subset. And so it's not that we want to have the whole visual field represented in the PFC, but rather just the stuff that's important so that we can focus on it and give that give that priority in the processing. So if you look at part of the job of the higher order theorist is not just to say where it happens. There's a step in there where you say like, where does it happen? Well, the way that we do it is we say what sorts of functions might involve the higher order representation. Why would we create this higher order representation? So you latch on to functions such as working memory or attention or action monitoring, and you say that kind of stuff would produce higher order representation. So where does that happen in the PFC? But backing up to that step about the function, it seems like most of the functions you would cite in favor of producing higher order representations are going to be associated with things that have jobs that are more associated with winnowing content, like with picking out a subset, a very small subset of the possible sensory content. Right? So like there's a prediction that the PFC would not be in the business of reproducing as much content as we find in our visual experience.
That's a possibility. Anatomically, I'm not sure, because these medial areas, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, they get a ton of input from sensory areas. There's a lot of input there. Now at the frontal pole and further forward, you don't get that kind of input, which looks like that's a possibility for getting like the highest level of abstract representations that are possible. But at least in these other areas, there's a tremendous amount of connectivity between what we think of as sensory areas, also, what we think of as memory areas, what we think of as self-representing areas, feeding into these prefrontal areas. Maybe the function of that is selection, as you say. Maybe the function of that is re-representation. I don't think we really know at this point. So I take your point. I do think that it would be somewhat, I think one of the fundamental things here is whether you think, so one of the fundamental issues, which I've come up across again and again when I think about this and talk to people about it, is what you think about the origin of brains. So many people that I know think that brains originated non-consciously, that they first showed up, they weren't conscious, and then you have to explain how consciousness arises from a brain, which is already controlling behavior adaptively, flexibly in response to the environment, but not experiencing anything. Whereas other people tend to assume at some level that, well, once you have the brain and flexible adaptive behavior, you have conscious experience, you have phenomenology, phenomenal consciousness. And it's not clear to me how to resolve that kind of issue. If it goes one way, then you can make sense of why there's all this extra machinery up there, which is re-representing everything. If it goes the other way, then it's a complete total mystery. But it's not it's not really clear to me what the right answer to that question is. Certainly the higher order view predicts the former, that brains started out non-consciously, and that probably your typical, honeybee is not conscious in the sense of having experience, unless you can show that it has the analog of higher order states, would be very surprising. I don't know. I think iguanas have some probably rudimentary higher order states, and I tend to think most animals do, that are mammals at least. It's not clear about the other ones, but anyway, so I think that's an open question. We just don't know. I think that's really one of the most conceptually difficult questions to answer.
Do you have a favorite candidate function for that which would be identified with the higher order states that are important for having conscious experience or necessary for having conscious experience? So like I just suggested, here's one possibility, working memory, right? Like that's just an example. Do you have, and another one would be confidence judgments, metacognitive abilities, having involving confidence. Would you have a function that you would, a favorite function that you would identify the production of the right kind of higher order states with?
No, not really. I think that probably the closest would be theory of mind, probably. So that the right higher order states sort of are generated out of our ability to talk about other people's mental states based on their behavior. Sort of the same for us. We notice ourselves acting in certain ways, and then we sort of go, oh, I must think something, I must be seeing something, and then that's going to be so that the function of the higher order states originates from our wanting to talk about minds generally, other people's and ourselves, which then becomes automated and second nature in a certain respect. And then, but I don't think that's, I don't think working memory is especially important for the relevant higher states.
Yeah.
Any of those.
So what I mean in cognitive science, with the functions that the brain is hypothesized to carry out, can you identify with any of the functions that are spoken of? So you would identify with possibly with theory of mind?
Oh, I wouldn't identify it, but I would. You were saying what function is it growing out of or associated with?
But in our like present day conscious experiences, which cognitive system is the one that is supplying the higher order states? So it might have grown out of theory of mind, but then it took on a different function. Now it becomes something like for introspection in general.
Right. So metacognition is the closest one, I would say.
Yeah, and so that's a very broad category. Metacognition could happen undoubtedly metacognition happens in a bunch of different ways. Right. Would you want to say that it's any kind of metacognition would produce is the right kind of higher order state, or just a certain subset, or it's just something you haven't thought about?
A special subset, definitely. Yeah.
So
it's kind of metacognition whereby you are aware of yourself as being in a kind of mental state. So that's not the typical kind of metacognition, but an awareness of oneself as, experiencing something and having a mental state in general.
Yeah, so I mean, it's still kind of, I would just love to graft it onto something that I'm familiar with, something that people, like people talk, what's metacognition? Well, we have this specific subset of confidence judgments. Is there another one that we could latch it on, put it onto? Because my suspicion is that we'll find that it would be unmotivated to hypothesize that whatever the system is actually going to be in the business of producing as many states as we would need, higher order states to fill out our phenomenology. Like, so you don't want to attach it to working memory, and that's fair enough. And it seems like a really bad candidate because working memory seems to be pretty limited.
Yeah.
Which means that if it was supplying our conscious experience, then we'd have something that seemed far off from rich.
Yeah, it'd be very sparse. Yeah, by definition.
So, but what is the fine-grained function that would create enough higher order states to fill out our phenomenology this richly? Like, so if it was analysis of our own minds, I wonder why we would need to be tracking this little area in the right part of our visual field. What color is right there?
Yeah, I don't think there's any need. It may simply be accidental.
And if there's the need, then why would the cognitive systems be representing it?
Well, because we're doing something else, which maybe was important, like metacognition in general, or theory of mind in general, and then they just kind of, for whatever reason, developed into doing this. And I don't think there's any special function which having conscious experiences allows us to do. I don't think there's anything really all that interesting about conscious experiences.
So you're talking about conscious experience now. I'm talking about whatever function it is that produces the higher order states that are necessary for conscious experience. And what function is that? And does that function plausibly involve producing lots of higher order states?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I haven't really put that much thought into it. I have to think about it more. I don't really have a good answer.
Yeah. And so, I mean, a very tentative argument that I put forth here is that if we run down a complete list of functions that we know are carried out in the PFC, we're not going to find any that produce these states in sufficient quantities to fill out our rich visual phenomenology.
We're not going to find anything that described in those terms seems like it has the job of representing all this detail. Yeah, and nonetheless we may still find that there's all that detail there. So I mean, like I said, I think it's an empirical issue, why it does it or what function is.
Yeah, so what I'm talking about is a theoretical reason for doubting that.
Yeah, I'm suspicious of all theoretical reasons for doubting anything.
What's that?
I'm suspicious of all theoretical reasons for doubting things.
So you're suspicious of philosophy?
Yes. I have a blog called Philosophy Sucks. You may have heard of it. Yeah.
Oh, I thought that was tongue in cheek.
It's actually a Primus ode to Primus.
Part of your bad boy image, Richard.
Yeah, right. No, it's actually partially a true expression of what I think about philosophy.
Well, yeah. What role does I mean? I guess good theoretical reasons can give us credences for what we want to believe at the present time, which might direct in what area we focus research resources, both philosophical and empirical.
But it can go really bad too. I mean, so there's good theoretical reasons for thinking that you should find the organ that controls behavior in the heart. It just turns out it's wrong. So having theoretical reasons for something is often just disguising a bias.
Right. Are you saying that theoretical reasons, they aren't always pointing toward true conclusions?
Yes. Yeah, so that's why I think we want data.
But maybe I don't have a ready reason for taking my theoretical considerations seriously in this case. But I mean, maybe one thing to think about is like, damn it, I know that content's in the PFC, so we're going to spend a whole bunch more money trying to find that content. Like, because I've got really strong theoretical reasons for thinking we're going to find it. And if you've got only weak theoretical reasons for thinking you're going to find it, you might want to use those resources for something else.
Right.
Like, for example, figuring out what it is, the sine qua non of neural activity that generates conscious experiences locally, such as like a local recurrency theory or something like that.
Well, that's who we're going up against in this experimental thing we're talking about. But I think we have lots of good theoretical reasons for looking at the PFC. They just don't come from these sorts of theoretical considerations. So, when things are subliminal, you don't get PFC activation. When they're conscious experience, you do. That occurs in every modality. In fact, even in emotional cases, when there's a threatening face there, you get amygdala activation, but not PFC if it's subliminal. And so we have tons of evidence actually that that some kind of global activation in the PFC is important for conscious experience. You could quibble with that and so forth and so on. We have also, I think, good evidence that it's local. I think there is evidence for that comes from lesion studies.
My friend,
we're investigating.
My friend Richard, I find this PFC correlation evidence just a little bit underwhelming.
Yes, I know. I suspected that you might, but that's why we need to investigate more. I mean, exactly that's the.
Right. So it's just if those things were theoretically strong in a way that I am not agreeing with so far, I grant that we have good reason to let's find that content in the PFC. Let's throw all our eggs in this basket, or put them gently in the basket.
Yes, exactly. But there's lots of reasons. I mean, many people have thought that there's this robust correlation between activity in the PFC when things are consciously experienced and not when they're not. And I go so far as to say at one point it was almost verging on being the received view. And that doesn't mean it's correct.
Yeah.
But it certainly means it's worth taking seriously and then looking into further. And that doesn't depend on there being any function or any theory associated with the thing in question. It just is that we find these kind of correlations. And so that suggests we should look into it further.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. So you have suggestive empirical results. What I take to be strong theoretical reasons. They all go into the same hopper, and then you make decisions on the basis of that.
Yeah. I mean, so we're right now in this thing I'll keep alluding to, we're looking at fMRI and behavioral data and change blindness, and slow change blindness is one of the, I think, better, it's one of the more interesting things that we're looking at here. But, so if the color in the background is slowly changing as you're doing a task in the center of the screen, you would expect, at least someone like me who has preference, some leaning towards rich content, you would expect that the color experience would be represented in the PFC, so you should be able to decode that. Even with something as coarse-grained as fMRI, you should be able to see some kind of connection between the color on the screen and the conscious experience of the person. So that's the sort of thing, if we do that and it doesn't pan out, if you can't decode that, then I would say, well, then the only plausible alternative is the sparse view, which I sort of have less credence in. I don't think it's obviously false or anything like that, but I definitely do. I would find it surprising if our experience generally were sparse. I would be more open towards looking at first order theories if it came back that way. Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if I'd abandon higher order theory. I mean, I'm not really, as you probably already know, I'm not like a true believer of higher order theory. I think it's something interesting that's worth exploring, but I don't know if it's true. I'm not committed to it.
Yeah, well, nor am I an absolute skeptic.
Yeah, exactly. So
perhaps it's when there's so much enthusiasm for higher order theory, perhaps it's good to look at its foundations.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if there's so much enthusiasm for it. I think it's often just dismissed out of hand and not taken very seriously, and straw man to death, and not in your work. No, not yours, Benji. No. but not. And I wasn't being sarcastic when I say that. I mean, and not. But I do think that, as we've been discussing here, even in work like yours, which is careful and thoughtful, there still is a lot of first order anti-higher order bias which creeps into the arguments, because you just can't help but thinking about consciousness in those terms. And that was my throwaway remark about theoretical considerations. I do think that a lot of theory is condensed into intuitions, and if you think something is intuitively this way, that really just means that you have some background theory which is making you think of things in those terms. I'm just susceptible. I'm not trying to disparage your work in any way. Remember, I'm the best host in the world. I love your work. But I do think that this is something we want to pay attention to. I was always someone who sort of found higher order theories intuitively plausible. Like when I first heard about them, I was like, yeah, duh, right? Yeah, what else could it be? So I have a bias in that sense, but I still can put myself in the position of the first order theorists, I think. But a lot of people don't have that response. They just think, look, this is the stupidest thing ever. You don't need to think about experience in order to have it. Those are the sorts of things which I think we need to guard against whenever we have these knee-jerk reactions, which is why we want the careful empirical work. The problem is getting the money, and that's hard. That's why, at this point we're asking Templeton for the money, and the good Templeton, I hear. I don't know if it is. That's what they say. It's the good Templeton. So, but they're willing to pony up some money, right? So that's what's good about this, is that if it were just a priori and there were no chance of empirically testing these things, I wouldn't be in this debate. I wouldn't care. I would just walk away. So it's only because there's the possibility of actually empirically testing this stuff that I think it's even interesting. And this goes back to even my earliest writings on higher order theory. I've only ever said, look, the theory is not obviously false, and it's worked out in enough detail that we could try to look at some experimental work and see how it fares.
Yeah. So, interestingly, it might be difficult. I think so. Your view is that if you could never absolutely empirically decide it, you might not be interested in the issue.
I absolutely would not be interested.
Yeah, and this is in principle, or if we have an issue that we in principle could not empirically decide, that's where I might not be interested. It could be that we could not in principle empirically decide something, but at least in some sense you could see how if our equipment was better, we would be able to decide it. I can be interested in those issues, even if it is outside of the realm of being able to empirically decide it in fact.
Yeah. So this is like, how I feel about string theory. String theory can't be tested now, but there's at least in principle ways that you could test it. So it's worth thinking about. And with respect to the higher order theory, maybe we can't definitively decide, but given the technological state we're in right now, we can still look at what the state of the evidence is and all things considered judgments of that nature. And, maybe fMRI is too crude of a instrument to really give definitive evidence, but, with ECOG and single cell recordings, I think there's a way that even where we're at now, we could get a lot better evidence for or against it. So I don't need it to be, but if it were just, if it were like panpsychism or something like that, where they're just not, it's like a metaphysical, or even materialism. It's like, in some sense, I don't really care about that debate as much because there's just no empirical work that could ever decide it.
Yeah, when you get right down to it, when you bottom out on the issue, it becomes pretty much an a priori matter.
Yeah, exactly. And I wrote a paper on zombies. I don't know how I got sucked into that debate, but I have one paper on zombies, my deprioritizing paper. And in that paper, I basically said, this is an empirical issue, actually. It may be the case that in principle, it's a priori knowable that materialism is false or that physicalism is true. But from our point of view, it's going to be an empirical matter that turns this issue one way or the other. So that's why, in much the same way with water and H2O, it's maybe in principle knowable that water is H2O. In principle, a priori, that you can know that. I believe that. I'm convinced by that, or at least have some credence in it. But even so, it was an empirical discovery on our behalf that got us to think that was true. Mm-hmm. Even if after that we could see in retrospect, yeah, you could deduce it or something like that. It's the empirical work that matters, and in particular in this case, it's what kind of concept of consciousness is the right one. I think that's what the empirical work really is going to move us forward in this debate. So yeah, honestly, I don't think that there are any interesting philosophical issues that are detached from empirical considerations. Even ethical. I mean, I'm more of a naturalist, I guess, than you are. Even about ethics, I'd make that claim.
More of a naturalist than I?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Insofar as that, I think even ethics is subject to empirical, even mathematics. I mean, all of it. If it's interesting, it's empirical. If it's otherwise, it's not interesting.
Okay, well, naturalism as a thesis about what is interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. We've already established you're more of a naturalist than me in that.
Yeah, exactly.
Only in the case of value theory.
So by this is sort of total non sequitur, but you think the same is true for math?
Well, I don't have anything to say about math, I guess.
Okay, because I think even there it's an empirical issue.
Mm-hmm. I don't understand metaphysical debates about math.
Okay. Anyway, so we don't need to talk about that, but yeah, I really do think that if it's not testable in principle, it's not worth talking about in a situation.
Well, to make it seem as if we've been talking about something substantial for the last few minutes, I'm going to bring it back to. I want to bring it back to the theoretical considerations thing with the PFC, because it seems to me that like if we couldn't find the content in the PFC, say we couldn't even find the sparse content in the PFC, we couldn't find the correlations that we wanted. The PFC is complicated enough, and our instruments might remain crude enough that maybe the higher order theorists could still claim, well, we can't find it because, it's just our instruments are crude, and it's tough studying the PFC and plasticity and mixed selectivity with the neurons and so forth, all that. At that point, someone might want to say, but what are the theoretical considerations for thinking that the PFC or any of the functions it carries out would even bother to represent as much content as you're talking about, right? So, I mean, you've already sort of stipulated that we will be able to empirically decide it. I'm saying, well, maybe someone, when it looks like it's not panning out, they're going to say, well, actually, we can't empirically decide.
Right.
Or they never committed to that in the first place. In which case you might still have to fall back on some of these theoretical considerations.
Well, let me say that what I meant was that I don't think we'll be able to decide it, but we'll get enough evidence to convince me to bail or not. So,
yeah.
So that you can always modify a theory to withstand any onslaught from the empirical work by saying instruments, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah,
so,
I've actually got an internet course on that. If you want to, is it okay if I plug it?
Of course.
Yeah. It's something about like how to modify any prediction so that it can withstand any results.
Right. Is this something I could put a link to in the?
Yes, it's $9.95.
Okay.
I'm gonna say it's not a real thing.
Okay. I don't know. Yeah, I'm gonna go to this thing at this Hatter talk on consciousness and falsifiability. I think it's next Monday. Anyway, so I think this is an important issue. If a theory
what is it on?
What?
What is it on? What is the talk on?
Consciousness and falsifiability.
Okay.
I forget who the author of the paper is. Falsification and Consciousness, Johannes Kleiner from Munich and Eric Hole from Tufts. That's who the author of the paper is. Anyway, so I think it's an important issue, and we don't, in the way science works is you never get full falsification, as far as I understand it, even with water and H2O, right? There's people just got basically bored pursuing the other alternatives, but even the quote unquote definitive experiment, which where you take the water and you separate the hydrogen and the oxygen, people were saying, oh, well, something happens in the tubes, and so I don't know. So there's always a way that you can weasel out of it and explain away the details, but after a while, it just gets not interesting anymore. And the other ideas are just more powerful and applicable in many other places. And so, I think it's sociological considerations that move science forward rather than any like you have to give up that theory or else. But so maybe there'll be diehards, but certainly I don't think if a certain set of experiments came out a certain way, then we would be justified in saying let's leave that alone at least until the technology gets better. And that would be my attitude.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know. There's going to come a point where we've drilled down pretty far, but we're never going to get so far that someone can't modify their theory in order to accommodate it. There's different thresholds that we might consider to be rationally appropriate.
Right.
But I mean, this has given me a little bit more confidence in my theoretical considerations the longer the conversation goes on. Because I mean, even in the case, so we want to use lesion data in order to evaluate higher order theory. It should be part of the data. So,
yeah.
But then, then some of the stuff we talked about earlier on, where you have a perfect lesion that knocks out the ability to create higher order states at all, and that would be the only thing that the person could even realize that there were deficits. So it turns out that if that scenario is correct, it might be that you can't use lesion data, right? So you can't use it to falsify it or confirm. You can't use it to confirm or disconfirm higher order theory, right? And you can't completely use the fMRI content studies in order to disconfirm higher order theory, because it could always be the case that the PFC is just too complex, right? So it's always going to have to be a combination of empirical results and theoretical considerations.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
I can't rule out the scenario you're talking about with the lesions, but if we adopt that, then we just can't use lesion evidence at all. And we're going to have to use theoretical considerations probably somewhere in there.
Yeah, I mean, I've never been a fan of using lesion evidence, so I'm not against that. that conclusion. I don't think anybody in the higher order camp has ever argued lesion evidence supports higher order theory. I think instead, what you find arguing is the thing we talked about, which is that people say lesion evidence falsifies higher theory, and we say no, it doesn't. And that, I think, withstands scrutiny. But it's not the case. I mean, so people say you'll never find any effects on conscious experience when you lesion. We say, yeah, there are some effects, at least in plausibly interpretable effects, but that doesn't establish that the higher order theory is true or even support it. It just mitigates an argument against it.
Mhm. I heard a higher order theorist once say that it supports it.
Who?
That's actually a joke.
Oh.
I've heard Hawkwan say that those studies support the theory. I think if you scan publications, there's times where they say they act to support. I mean, we're getting into some fine grained issues here about like what counts as support and what counts as just merely merely undermining an argument against.
Yeah. Well, let me just go on record saying that's my view, is that it undermines an argument against.
Yeah.
More importantly than the lesion stuff, for me, would be the decoding and ultimately, can you stimulate and produce? I mean, that to me, if you can stimulate the prefrontal cortex and then you taste chocolate, then I'm saying that's about as good as we can get. If you knock that,
and you show that it's not a cascading effect into the
you'd have to show it's not a cascading effect. Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the troubles here, is how we show that sort of stuff. But they're experimentalists are clever, and you don't need perfect evidence. I don't think we're ever going to get definitive like certainty with respect to any of this stuff. I think that's not the way science works at all. Rather, you get to the point where you're like, okay, this explains a lot, and it fits with a bunch of other stuff that we find. And so, it's good working hypothesis. And then eventually that's good enough. But I don't think that there's ever a time where you go, this definitively shows one where that never happens. That's just not science. That's not what they do. That's what their business is.
You get proofs in logic. That's about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And even there, depends on your choice of axioms and all kinds of, background stuff. So I have trouble with that stuff as well. So, I'm a million about math. So I think it's not a very popular view nowadays, but I think, it's a good idea. It's inductive generalizations based on experience. What do you want? Oh, it's pretty good. It's a theory which describes the stuff that we see. That's what arithmetic and those sorts of things are. But anyway, so I just don't think that if what you're looking for is like, will we ever definitively show that this is the case or not? The answer is obviously not. But the question is, will we ever get to the point where the balance of evidence tips in one direction or another, where we have to ad hocly modify things too many times? I think, yeah, we are already almost at that point where first order views seem to me like they have to do a lot of patchwork to account for the sorts of things that we say. Plus, there are some theoretical problems with first order views already. So there's some considerations there about that we talked about at the beginning, which you said you didn't want to talk about. But I think that there are these questions about, well, what's the difference between a conscious state and an unconscious state? If it's not the facts that there's kind of higher representation of it, then what is it? And no one's ever given a good answer to that, so I think those kinds of things do suggest that it's worth taking serious the higher order approach.
I don't remember saying I didn't want to talk about it, but that's neither here nor there.
Well, you stormed out, remember? You left. They're like, I didn't sign up for this.
That's right.
Yeah, but
out at that point.
Yeah, the inaccessible consciousness stuff, to me, it's like bordering on a contradiction. It's not exactly a contradiction, but I think it's like pretty close to one, actually. It's like almost conceptually incoherent. Yeah, so I think, you have a problem with inflation and you're not sure what that would amount to. I have a problem with the inaccessible consciousness. I just don't even know what that means or how to make sense of it. That's probably a shortcoming on my part. I don't know, but I just think that's bizarre, if anything is. So that suggests some kind of access to me is important. Now, is it cognitive access? I don't know. Like you talk to people like Ned and he says, well, no, there's access, but it's not cognitive. And I said, well, what else is there? He says, I don't know, some deflationary something or another, or some other thing. It's like, well, no one's ever come up with another thing, which explains the kind of access that we have, which is not cognitive. That doesn't mean they won't. And if I'm looking all the time for people who are writing on this stuff, and maybe someone will say something that's plausible about how there could be a kind of access which is not cognitive. But I just, I find that to be completely mysterious.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's, like any good, interesting issue, there's things which pull you in one direction and things which pull you in the other direction. And we're stuck here saying, well, what would count as good evidence for or against it? Which is why I want to do as many of these experiments as we can and get as much data as we can and see what overall. I mean, this is basically Ned's mesh argument, which I wholly endorse. I just don't endorse the conclusion of it, that he thinks there's a better mesh towards the first order view. I think there's an equally good mesh towards the higher order view. And so what we need is more considerations to throw into the mix.
I concur.
Yeah, exactly. So, and so I
about the credences and all of it, like, it needs serious work on a whole bunch of, in many cases, small issues.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then we put it all together.
Absolutely.
And I'd say, I wish there were more hours in the day, and I wish my life was going to be longer than whatever it is, because I would love to be working more to, at the same time, be working more to try and flesh out the first order theory.
Yeah.
But Richard, that's not my lot.
Sorry. Well, you'll upload to the singularity.
I'm sorry.
I said you'll upload to the singularity and then have all the time you need.
Right. It's something I'll approach more in my autumn years.
Yeah, exactly.
Wait, they're telling me I'm already in my autumn years.
Wait, this just in. I'm already in my autumn years. Exactly. All right, man. I really got to get out of here because I'm noticing it's already, wow, it's been going on here for like almost 2 hours and 40 minutes. So it's a long time. Yeah, but I want to thank you again for this interesting conversation. As usual, I learned a lot from thinking through things from your point of view, and I think this kind of work is important and interesting. So I'm glad that it's being done. And I'll, is there anything you want to end with? You can have the final word if you want it.
Wait, I can do that better.
There you go. There's that incredulous stare I've been waiting for.
All right, you're supposed to put it off there, but we're good.
Okay, hold on a second. I'll say bye to you off the air. But thanks again, Ben.
No, thank you very much, Richard. This is fantastic.
Cool. All right. Let's see here.